The executive dining room on the 42nd floor of the Morrison Financial Tower in Chicago buzzed with the quiet energy of power lunches and million-dollar handshakes. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, Lake Michigan stretched endlessly, its surface catching the afternoon sun like scattered diamonds. I sat at the mahogany table, my Caesar salad barely touched, listening to the quarterly board presentation with the same attention I'd given to hundreds of similar meetings over the past 15 years. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Victoria Chen. And for a decade and a half, I had been the backbone of Morrison Financial's risk assessment division. While others chased promotions and corner offices, I had quietly become the person who signed off on every major investment, every acquisition, every strategic partnership that crossed the company's desk. The woman who said yes or no to deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But that afternoon, everything changed. Director James Whitmore strutted into the dining room 20 minutes late, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor like a countdown timer. At 52, he embodied everything wrong with corporate culture. All swagger, no substance. His silver hair was slicked back with expensive gel, and his custom suit probably cost more than most people's cars. He'd been hired 6 months ago as Director of Strategic Innovation, a title that seemed to mean nothing except giving him license to dismiss anyone over 40 as legacy thinking. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, not bothering to sit down, "I have exciting news about our digital transformation initiative." The projector hummed to life, casting his first slide onto the wall. Modernization, out with the old. My stomach tightened as I recognized the familiar corporate doublespeak that usually preceded layoffs. "We're streamlining our approval processes," Whitmore continued, his voice dripping with rehearsed confidence, "eliminating redundant positions that slow down our agility in today's fast-paced market." He clicked to the next slide, and my world tilted sideways. There, in stark black text on a white background, was my photo from the company directory next to the words Risk Assessment Obsolescence Initiative. The room fell silent, except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning. I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me, some sympathetic, others carefully neutral. My fork trembled slightly in my hand, but I kept my expression unchanged. 15 years of board meetings had taught me that showing weakness was like blood in the water. "Victoria Chen has served admirably," Whitmore said, his tone suggesting he was discussing a broken printer than a human being. "But her traditional approach to risk assessment is, frankly, obsolete. We're moving toward AI-driven analytics and automated approval systems. The future doesn't need manual oversight." He lingered on those last words like they were diseased. Board member Patricia Wells shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but said nothing. CFO Robert Martinez stared at his wineglass. Even CEO Margaret Foster, who had personally recruited me 15 years ago, avoided eye contact. They all knew what was happening, and none of them had the courage to stop it. "Effective next quarter," Whitmore continued, "risk assessment will be handled by our new algorithmic systems overseen by a fresh team of data scientists, young minds, unencumbered by outdated methodologies." The presentation continued with buzzwords: machine learning, predictive analytics, disruption, innovation. Each slide was another shovelful of dirt on the grave of my career. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, while inside, something cold and calculating began to stir. When Whitmore finished his presentation, he finally sat down and cut into a steak with theatrical precision. "Questions?" he asked, though his tone suggested he expected none. "Just one," I said quietly, my voice carrying across the silent room like a blade through silk. Whitmore looked up, surprised I had spoken. "Yes? When does this transition take effect?" He smiled, the kind of shark might wear before attacking. "Immediately.
Your final day will be next Friday. HR will handle the, details. I nodded once, reached for my water glass, and took a slow sip. Around the table, the other executives began to murmur among themselves, the tension breaking as they realized the execution was over. But I wasn't finished. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single manila folder, worn at the edges from years of use. I placed it on the table in front of me, my fingers resting lightly on its surface.
James, I said, my voice still calm, still professional. Before we conclude, I think there's something the board should know about the Meridian acquisition you're fast-tracking. The room went quiet again. Whitmore's fork paused halfway to his mouth. The $300 million telecommunications deal you're so eager to approve, I continued, the one you've been calling a sure thing in your reports to the board. What about it? Whitmore asked, but something in his voice had changed. The confidence was still there, but underneath it, I detected the first note of uncertainty. I smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. Well, that's interesting, because according to my analysis, Meridian Technologies has been cooking their books for the past 18 months. Their revenue projections are fraudulent. Their debt is hidden through shell companies, and they're about 6 weeks away from a federal investigation. The silence was deafening. That's impossible, Whitmore stammered. Our due diligence team cleared them completely. Your due diligence team, I corrected, relied on surface-level financial reports and algorithmic analysis. They never dug deep enough to find the real story. I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, a bank transfer record I'd obtained through a contact in forensic accounting. Shell company transactions. Meridian's executives have been moving money through fake subsidiaries to inflate their quarterly numbers. CFO Martinez leaned forward, his face pale. Victoria, if this is accurate— It is, I said simply. I've spent the last 3 months investigating every detail of this deal because something felt wrong. My obsolete, manual oversight methods uncovered what your shiny new algorithms missed. I pulled out another document, communication intercepts from a whistleblower inside Meridian. They've been bribing municipal officials to secure contracts they couldn't win legitimately. Whitmore's face was turning an interesting shade of red. You can't just— Where did you get this information? From 15 years of building relationships, James. From knowing which questions to ask and which people to trust. From understanding that sometimes human intuition catches what computers missed. I placed the final document on the table, a preliminary SEC investigation notice that wouldn't be public for another week. Meridian Technologies is about to become the center of one of the largest corporate fraud cases in telecommunications history. If Morrison Financial had proceeded with the acquisition, we would have become co-defendants in a federal prosecution. The room was so quiet, I could hear the tick of the antique clock on the far wall. CEO Foster finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. How much exposure would we have had? $300 million in direct investment, plus another $200 million in expansion funding you approved for next year. Conservative estimate of legal fees and penalties? Another $100 million, minimum. I looked directly at Whitmore. Your sure thing would have cost Morrison Financial roughly $600 million and possibly criminal charges for executives who signed off on the deal. The color had completely drained from Whitmore's face. His steak sat forgotten, growing cold on his plate. But here's the really interesting part, I continued, my voice growing stronger. This deal can only proceed with final approval from the head of risk assessment. That would be me. And under my current contract, which was renewed just 6 months ago, I retain final veto power over any acquisition exceeding $250 million until my replacement is officially trained and certified by the board. I let that sink in for a moment.
since you're eliminating my position rather than replacing me with a human, and since algorithmic systems can't be certified for final approval authority under federal banking regulations, my veto power remains in effect until Morrison Financial hires a human being to do the job you just declared obsolete. Patricia Wells was frantically taking notes. Martinez had pulled out his phone and was typing furiously. Foster looked like she was calculating the cost of her mistake in real time. "So, here's my decision," I said, standing up and closing the folder. "I exercise my veto power over the Meridian acquisition effective immediately. The deal is dead." I turned to look directly at Whitmore, who seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. "You called me obsolete, James, but obsolete things have a funny way of being exactly what you need when everything new fails you."
The legal team had agreed readily, assuming it was a ceremonial power that would never be used. After all, who would be foolish enough to fire the person with veto authority? Apparently, James Whitmore would. But the real genius of the clause wasn't the veto power itself. It was the conditions under which that power could be transferred. According to the contract, my authority could only pass to another human being who had been certified by the board as qualified to make final acquisition decisions. Since Whitmore was eliminating human oversight entirely in favor of algorithmic systems, and since algorithms couldn't be certified under federal banking regulations, my veto power couldn't be transferred. Which meant that as long as I remained employed by Morrison Financial, I could single-handedly block any major acquisition. And under the severance terms of my contract, if I were terminated without cause before my replacement was properly certified, I would retain my veto power as a consultant for a period of 2 years while receiving full salary and benefits. I had essentially negotiated myself into a position where firing me would be more expensive than keeping me, and where trying to marginalize me would only strengthen my hand. My phone rang, interrupting my review. The caller ID showed Foster, M. "Victoria." CEO Margaret Foster's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "We need to talk." "I'm listening." "Not over the phone. Can you come back to the office?" I glanced at the clock on my desk. It was barely 3 p.m. "I thought I was obsolete, Margaret. Why would you need obsolete technology to come back to the office?" The silence on the other end stretched for nearly 10 seconds. "Victoria, please, we need to discuss the Meridian situation." "What's to discuss? I exercise my veto power, as outlined in my contract. The deal is dead." "There has to be some way to work this out. James says he can implement additional safeguards, bring in human oversight for the algorithmic systems." I almost laughed. "Margaret, 6 hours ago, your director of strategic innovation stood in front of the board and declared that human oversight was obsolete. Now you want me to believe he's suddenly discovered the value of manual processes?" "The board is meeting at 4. We'd like you to present your findings about Meridian." "To what end?" Another long pause. "To help us understand how we missed something this significant." Now I did laugh. You didn't miss it, Margaret. You chose to ignore the systems and people who would have caught it. You can't have it both ways. Either experience and human judgment matter, or they don't. I could hear her breathing, calculating. Margaret Foster hadn't built Morrison Financial from a mid-sized regional bank to a national powerhouse by being stupid. She was realizing, probably for the first time, exactly what she had signed off on when Whitmore convinced her to modernize the risk assessment division. "What do you want, Victoria?" The question hung in the air between us like a loaded gun. What did I want? 6 hours ago, I would have said job security and professional respect. Now, with my insurance files spread across my desk and the full scope of my leverage becoming clear, I realized I wanted something much more interesting. I want James Whitmore to personally explain to the board how his innovative, cutting-edge due diligence process failed to detect a $600 million fraud that was uncovered by obsolete manual oversight. Victoria, I want him to walk the board through his methodology step by step and explain why algorithms are superior to human judgment when the algorithms just nearly destroyed the company. That might be difficult. Then perhaps James isn't as confident in his revolutionary approach as he claimed to be at lunch? I could practically hear Margaret's jaw clench. Fine. 4 o'clock, conference room A. I'll be there. And Margaret, I'll be bringing my files. After I hung up, I sat back in my chair and looked at Einstein, who had taken up residence on my windowsill. "Well, Kat, looks like we're going back to the office." Einstein flicked his tail once, unimpressed by the human drama unfolding around him, but I felt a smile tugging at my lips as I began gathering my binders. For 15 years, I had been the quiet professional, the steady hand, the voice of caution in a room full of risk-takers. I had swallowed insults, absorbed blame, and watched younger, flashier executives take credit for my work. But now, for the first time in my career, I held all the cards, and I was about to teach James Whitmore exactly why experience and human judgment would never be obsolete. The boardroom at 4 p.m. was a study in corporate tension. The mahogany table that had seemed so elegant at lunch now felt like a battlefield, with territorial lines drawn by positioning and posture. Margaret Foster sat at the head, her usual composed demeanor cracked by stress lines around her eyes. The other board members arranged themselves with careful neutrality, while James Whitmore occupied the chair farthest from me, looking like a man who had swallowed something unpleasant. I entered exactly on time, my 3 binders stacked neatly in my arms, and took the seat I had occupied for countless meetings over the years. But this time felt different. This time, I wasn't there to provide quiet counsel or risk assessment. I was there to demonstrate exactly why they couldn't afford to lose me. "Thank you for coming back, Victoria," Margaret began, her voice carefully professional. "We've reviewed your preliminary findings about Meridian Technologies, and we need to understand the full scope of the situation." I opened the first binder and spread the documents across the table like a poker player revealing a royal flush. Bank transfer records, shell company registrations, falsified revenue reports, and communication intercepts formed a damning mosaic of corporate fraud. "The fraud began 18 months ago," I said, my voice steady and clinical. "Meridian's CEO, Thomas Bradley, was facing a hostile takeover attempt. Rather than fight it legitimately, he chose to inflate the company's value through a network of shell companies based in Delaware and the Cayman Islands." I pointed to a series of bank transfers. "These transactions show money moving in circles. Meridian would send funds to subsidiaries that existed only on paper, then those subsidiaries would purchase services from Meridian at inflated prices, creating artificial revenue." CFO Robert Martinez leaned forward, studying the documents. "How much artificial revenue are we talking about?" Conservative estimate? $180 million over 18 months.
Meridian's actual revenue is roughly 60% of what they've reported to potential investors. Patricia Wells was taking notes furiously. How did our due diligence team miss this? I turned to look directly at James Whitmore, who had remained silent since I'd entered the room. Perhaps Mr. Whitmore can explain his innovative methodology. Whitmore cleared his throat, his earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort. Our algorithmic analysis systems are designed to identify patterns in publicly available financial data. They're more efficient and objective than manual review processes. Efficient, I repeated. Let me show you just how efficient they are. I opened the second binder and pulled out a thick stack of reports. These are the due diligence findings your team submitted to the board over the past 6 months. Notice anything interesting? I spread the reports across the table. Each one bore the signature of different analysts, but the formatting, language, and even some of the conclusions were nearly identical. Your algorithms, I continued, are essentially sophisticated copy and paste programs. They pull data from the same public sources, run it through the same analytical frameworks, and produce reports that look thorough but contain no actual investigation. Margaret Foster picked up a report, her frown deepening as she scanned it. These all look the same. Because they are the same. Algorithm-generated boilerplate with company names swapped in and out. I pulled out a highlighted section. This paragraph, praising Meridian's robust quarterly growth trajectory, appears word for word in 6 other acquisition targets. The room was silent, except for the rustle of papers as board members examined the evidence. Now, I said, opening the third binder, let me show you what actual due diligence looks like. The documents I spread out this time were different. Handwritten notes from phone calls with Meridian employees, printed emails from industry contacts, copies of local newspaper articles about municipal contract disputes, bank deposit slips obtained through forensic accounting contacts, SEC filing discrepancies highlighted in different colored pens. This is what 15 years of relationship building looks like, I said. When I had questions about Meridian's municipal contracts, I called a friend who works in procurement for the city of Atlanta. When their revenue numbers seemed suspicious, I reached out to a former colleague who now works in forensic accounting. When I needed to verify their shell company structures, I contacted someone I know at the Delaware Secretary of State's office. I picked up a handwritten page covered with my own notes. This is from a 40-minute phone conversation with a former Meridian engineer who left the company 6 months ago. He told me about pressure from management to inflate project timelines and costs. That led me to investigate their billing practices, which led me to the shell companies. Board member David Chang spoke for the first time. How long did this investigation take you?
3 months of evening and weekend work. About 60 hours total. Whitmore finally found his voice. 60 hours per acquisition target would slow our approval process to a crawl. We'd miss market opportunities. I smiled, the same calm smile I'd given him at lunch. James, how much would 60 hours of my time have cost the company? He looked confused by the question. My hourly rate, including benefits and overhead, is approximately $150 per hour. 60 hours of investigation would have cost Morrison Financial $9,000. I let that number hang in the air for a moment. Your efficient, streamlined process was about to cost us $600 million. I'm having trouble with the math on which approach is more cost-effective. Margaret Foster set down the report she'd been reading and looked directly at Whitmore. James, I need you to explain how your team's analysis missed all of this. Whitmore shifted in his chair, his silver hair no longer perfectly styled. The algorithms are designed to identify patterns in structured data. This type of investigative work isn't something that can be automated. Exactly, I said quietly. Human judgment, relationship building, and experience-based intuition
aren't obsolete. They're irreplaceable. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Lake Michigan while I let the implications settle over the room. There's something else you should know, I continued without turning around. Meridian isn't the only problematic deal in your pipeline. The silence behind me was deafening. I turned back to face the room. Remember the Pinnacle software acquisition you're fast-tracking for next month? The $150 million deal that's supposed to revolutionize our client relationship management? Whitmore's face went pale again. What about it? Pinnacle's lead developer died in a car accident 4 months ago. He was the only person who fully understood their core architecture. The software you're buying is essentially unmaintainable legacy code with no documentation and no one left alive who can modify it. I pulled another folder from my binder. I discovered this through a casual conversation with someone at a tech meetup. Pinnacle's executives have been very careful not to disclose this information to potential buyers. CFO Martinez was now openly calculating on his phone. If we can't maintain or modify the software, it's worthless, I finished. Another $150 million down the drain because algorithms can't attend networking events or have informal conversations with industry contacts. Margaret Foster closed her eyes and rubbed her temples. When she opened them again, she looked directly at me. Victoria, what would it take to get you to withdraw your resignation from the risk assessment position? I had been expecting this question, but hearing it still sent a thrill through me. For the first time in 15 years, I was negotiating from a position of absolute strength. I never resigned. I was terminated by Mr. Whitmore in front of the entire board because my methods were declared obsolete. That was a mistake, Margaret said carefully. Yes, it was. The question now is how you plan to correct it. I returned to my seat and placed my hands flat on the table, looking at each board member in turn. Here are my terms. First, James Whitmore issues a public apology to the staff for his premature conclusions about the value of human oversight. Second, the Risk Assessment Division is restored with expanded authority to investigate any acquisition over $100 million. Third, I want a seat on the board of directors with voting rights on all major acquisitions. The room erupted in murmured conversations. A seat on the board would make me one of the most powerful people at Morrison Financial, with influence over every major decision the company made. Margaret raised her hand for silence. Victoria, those are significant requests. They're not requests, they're requirements. You have two choices. Accept my terms and benefit from 15 years of institutional knowledge and proven results, or continue with your current approach and explain to shareholders why you're losing hundreds of millions of dollars to easily preventable fraud. I stood up and began packing my binders. I'll give you 24 hours to decide. Until then, my veto power remains in effect for any acquisition over $250 million.
As I reached the door, Margaret called after me. Victoria, what if we agree to your terms? What happened to James? I paused with my hand on the doorknob and looked back at Whitmore, who seemed to shrink under my gaze. That's not my decision to make, I said, but I would suggest that Mr. Whitmore might want to update his resume. The market for directors who specialize in calling experienced professionals obsolete is probably quite limited. I walked out of the boardroom for the second time that day, but this time, I knew I wouldn't be walking out alone. The next morning, I was sitting in my home office with Einstein purring on my lap when my phone rang. Margaret Foster's name appeared on the caller ID. The board voted, she said without preamble, unanimously in favor of your terms. I smiled, scratching Einstein behind the ears. All of them. James Whitmore has decided to pursue other opportunities. His resignation will be announced this afternoon. I looked out my window at Lake Michigan, where the morning sun was turning the water into liquid gold. Somewhere in the distance, a foghorn sounded, low and confident. When do I start? I asked. You never stopped, Margaret replied. Welcome to the board, Victoria. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my office for a long moment. Yesterday morning, I was a mid-level executive facing forced retirement. Today, I was one of the most powerful people at a major financial institution with the authority to shape the company's future and the respect I had earned over 15 years of quiet excellence. Einstein stretched and yawned, unimpressed by the dramatic reversal of fortune. But I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of being valued for exactly who I was, rather than who someone else thought I should become. They had called me obsolete, but I had shown them something that would never go out of style: the irreplaceable value of experience, relationships, and human judgment. And in a world increasingly dominated by algorithms and automation, that made me not obsolete, but essential. The future, it turned out, still needed people who remembered how to think,